Our story begins in the forest. Some people were running through the branches without stopping to think about the moment. They jumped from tree to tree with extraordinary speed and then stopped for a while after seeing a bed and a fire. They start to smile when they see the scene, drawing their knives. At that moment, they all start to prepare at once until they attack with everything in that place. When the knife is thrown on the bed, a hole forms, but there is no reaction at that moment until someone shouts that it was there. The man turns around and sees a boy with a bow in his hand. Since they were armed, he could kill them all, right? So that would mean it was self-defense. With the arrow in hand, he grabs a branch from a tree and the people start laughing in his face, saying they were joking with him. However, the branch hits one of them in the head and ends up going through, killing him instantly. The tension rises as the boy watches the intruders, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. The attackers, initially surprised by the boy's precision, hesitated for a moment. This brief moment of hesitation is enough for the boy to act again. He moves quickly, grabbing another sharp branch and throwing it with the same deadly precision. Another of the invaders falls, and the rest begin to retreat, realizing that the boy was not a helpless victim. As the group disperses, the boy stands firm, ready to defend his territory at any cost. He takes a deep breath, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of the unexpected battle. The forest, which was once calm, is now a silent battlefield. The boy looks around, checking that all the intruders are gone, before finally lowering his makeshift weapon. He knew he would always have to be vigilant, as the threat could return at any time. He ends up falling from the tree from a considerable height, causing great surprise and excitement among the others who were present. For a moment, everyone is scared, and he is quickly nicknamed Vis. In the midst of this confusion, an invisible arrow is skillfully created and shot by the bow of that boy who was also in the scene. The arrow hits a nearby target, resulting in the death of one of those present. With that, the boy continues to count his fatal actions. The last individual, more scared than the others, watches in despair as his allies who arrived as reinforcements are eliminated one by one. In a desperate gesture, he grabs another branch, begging to be spared. But if he intends to kill someone, he must be prepared to face death as well. And then, another arrow is fired, hitting him squarely and making him fall hard. Now, there shouldn't be any traces left. The boy looks down and calls out to Darian, reflecting on how different things are from what he had been told. Then he jumps over the trees and continues his journey, muttering that the world was much more boring than usual. Much time has passed, and the Demon King's tracks are left untouched. If we are talking about the Forest of Roots, no living organism with demonic energy will be able to cross the magical barrier. But does it really matter? We arrive at a meeting between figures who appear to be of great importance. They continue to discuss uneasily about how the forest is covered in such dense demonic energy. The fact that they cannot use such a large portion of land is a huge problem, and this is undeniably true. Then, one of the gentlemen present starts to laugh and comments that if no one can return alive from the forest permeated with demonic energy, this is a great challenge for everyone. So why don't they just send people who want to die there? They talked better about this situation. One of them continues talking, noting that it's always a problem to deal with certain people, and there's no better place than that forest to get rid of them. The idea seemed excellent, and they really considered the possibility of taking such an action. Therefore, they decide to continue with this plan. Meanwhile, in the forest, someone desperately screams for mercy, begging them to take him instead of the poor child. The screams echo through the dark forest. He begs to be freed, but the seed of darkness had already been planted in the child, and it was the beginning of something terrible. The child was destined for a dark fate, and pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears. Then a baby starts glowing and the person keeps screaming for mercy. A mother, 3 priests, and a warrior begin to pray around the child until, at the moment, they shout out the name Helmut Rays, a place of exile where no one ever returned alive, not even the brave twin commanders or incredible mages. The criminals will be dropped somewhere in the forest using divine magic. But if they manage to get out of there alive, their sins will be forgiven. And one day, the existence of the baby, born with the seed of darkness, became its own sin. The child begins to open his eyes and begins to cry. He was left in a demonic place where no one returned alive, and there it stayed. The forest was full of demonic energy, cold, hunger, treating a child harshly. But the seed energy that was embedded in his heart surged and covered him. 10 days passed. He went through the day, the night, even the rain, and the child survived. In the middle of this, a strange and giant tiger appears. He was white, and he approaches the child and holds him. That day, the fate of that child was decided. That's how 10 years passed, and there was someone running after a rabbit, telling it to stop right there, and even calling it damned. It was a child. The child jumps over the rabbit and tells him to be good and die soon, and thus manages to capture him. He is happy, telling Alaga that he ended up catching a tiger, then comes down from the trees and ends up killing it, saying that he got used to hunting. He says yes, but so far he can only hunt rabbits, but he had to look carefully. In the claws of that tiger was a small seed. He says that it was known as the core. All demonic beasts have this. These demonic beasts grow stronger if they eat it, and it also supplements them with vital energy and increases their useful life. This core is small because the rabbit is weak since this came from prey he hunted. He tries to catch it, but the tiger hits him hard, telling him not to go so fast. The protagonist struggles on the ground, saying that he wants some beads too, but the tiger won't let him. He is a human, not a demonic beast. If he eats this, he will become a demonic beast, and if that happens, he will have to live in that forest forever. He turns his face to the side, saying that it was ridiculous, and even if he doesn't eat it, he'll be stuck there. Anyway, there wasn't much to do. Wouldn't it be better if he ate, if he got stronger and stronger? He's still too weak to go anywhere in the territory. That was true. The tiger then turns to the side, saying that he could get out, and the protagonist is confused and then repeats it, saying that he could get out of that forest. And as he knows this, he said that not even they could get out of there since he never saw anyone leaving. He thought no one could. But someone said it was possible, and who said it to the tiger? A human he had met in the past. The protagonist is thoughtful about that and asks about the human, and then the protagonist asks if he was thinking of looking for him. He is sure that he died somewhere in that forest, and the protagonist says that he could still be alive. He saw him die with his own eyes. The tiger doesn't respond, but the silhouette hits him on the head, saying that that human was old. He was very strong in the past, but no matter the comfort a human is, they would stay weaker because he can't handle the demonic energy of that forest, and he can't feel it because the protagonist has the seed of darkness. It's been a long time since I last saw him. He must have been around 90 years old, and I didn't say that humans can live to be 100 years old or more. Where he met that person, fed and raised the protagonist. But now you would be determined to leave, right? This situation was shameful. He said that to live the way he was when he grew up. Yes, he could even live, but that man is no longer there either. The protagonist says that he can even come back if he's not there, but the tiger gets angry, saying that he should go ahead then and do what he wants, whatever. The protagonist asks where the place was, and the tiger says it was east of that place. So, the protagonist quickly turns around and runs with everything. The tiger is confused and says he doesn't care if he dies along the way. The protagonist gets excited, saying that he would be thinking that there is a year in that forest. He is a very strong human who does not have the seed of darkness, another human like the protagonist. He gets tired after a while, and in the middle, he hits a wall. He wonders if there was a place like that there. The protagonist jumps over it and sees a house, saying that he's sure only humans could do things like that. Then, finally, a man ends up holding the protagonist with everything on the ground. He pushes him with his head just like that and asks who he is and who sent him. The protagonist says he is alone and says that Alaga said there would be a human there. You ask for this name, and so he releases the protagonist, saying that he understands that situation. And so he starts to pant. The man asks why he was seeing him and if he was human and wanted to find someone else. He came to the wrong person. The protagonist says that it wasn't that. He just wants to get out of that forest. He stands up as I said this kind of thing. That gentleman's name is Darian. And what would be his? The protagonist introduces himself, and then he wanted to escape that situation. Well, he was told that that human knows how to get out of that forest, and why would he be trying to get out of there? The outside world is not as beautiful and peaceful a place as he thinks it could be. The protagonist asks what he is like and says that the humans out there are weak and do not have sharp claws or sharp teeth. However, they are much more cruel and cunning. They also join forces or treat each other when in need. I ask, this protagonist was born in that forest. He says no. Apparently he was sent after he was born. So he must have the seed of darkness. That was exactly it. Those born with the seed are usually killed as soon as they are born. But considering he was spared, he must have a very important lineage. He must be at least a noble. The protagonist asks what this is, since he doesn't know what social classes are. He says he thinks it's something like the bloodline. It doesn't mean anything since he was sent there. You said you owe a debt to that leopard, so you should listen carefully. The reason he left you in this forest is because of that seed of darkness inside him. Once he is inside the protagonist, it doesn't matter what happens. He will always be chased, even without leaving that forest, and will probably die fighting with another human. Would he still want to leave? The protagonist responds yes. So, you say that you understand that everything would be fine. He takes the protagonist under the arm and asks him what was happening at that moment. The protagonist stands aside and thus becomes confused and angry. You say that he has quite a temperament, and if he wants to go to the human world, he first needs to become one. It was time to move on, to transform that child into a human being. The protagonist asks what he has to do to get out of that place, and the man responds that he needs to cross the forest barrier, but he was supposed to forget about it while he is like that. First, he needs to get a lot stronger. After that, he should see someone who knows how to get through the barrier. He asks who. You say you couldn't tell him that yet. He wonders how he could do this to get stronger. You say it was just to do what he said. Then, after a while, he drops a broom and asks why he had to do that. The man responds to the boy that humans normally live like that and asks if he also lives that way, as he was too dirty at that moment. That house looked abandoned after so long because it wasn't that clean. So, he asks if he wants to continue living in this forest, and the protagonist, very irritated, starts cleaning that thing. After a while, he sees a handmade bed and asks what that could be. It was the protagonist's bed. Then he lays down and says it was wow and asks if I could rest now. You say that he is very lazy because he was supposed to get up at that moment. There is still a lot to do. He was supposed to put those clothes there. The protagonist says that he finds the clothes tight and uncomfortable. Well, Romans need to wear clothes. He doesn't have many, so he shouldn't ruin them. The protagonist is completely uncomfortable with that. So soon after he leaves, and they ask why they went outside because there is something he needs to know. It will teach him what he can and cannot eat, as well as things that are edible. Organic roots have cores. Even after removing them, they would still possess demonic energy. However, there is one thing that does not have energy, and that is water. You can remove the core and purify the organism of its demonic energy with water. So, he asks to take a piece, and the protagonist then eats it quickly, and even the plants are edible. It was fascinating. If he was done, we could go back and call it a day, right? After a while, the protagonist was tired, and he certainly needs human knowledge. But what does this have to do with getting water? He had 2 buckets in his hand as he got more water. Even though he has been doing these odd tasks a day, he is no longer tormented too much. The leopard arrives all over the protagonist. I asked what he was doing if he was trying to be funny. The protagonist responds that that man told him to get water, and why is he listening? That bro never listens to what she says. The protagonist says that he would get stronger that way. What was said to that old man, and what will he do when he gets stronger? Will leave the forest. He asks himself. The protagonist responds by saying that he is grizzly. He never said that the protagonist was a demonic beast, so he has to go to the human world. So, leopard, I decided to ask if the protagonist thinks it's a good thing. Will it happen when he leaves? He says he doesn't know, but nothing good will happen if he stays. He has to go and then see that leopard who is left alone and sad. At that moment, turning his face away, well, he says that he is sure he will have a good life, and so he leaves. Then, a bucket of water is thrown, and the protagonist is all wet. At that moment, doing physical exercises, the man asked to make his back straight as quickly as possible. He says he was tired at that moment, and so you ask him if he wants to leave that forest or not. And the protagonist keeps doing it, no matter what. Well, he was holding up well at that point, and he thinks someone who survived in the forest was different. He was born with many things besides the seed of darkness, so it's worth teaching how to get out of that place. After a while, it had passed, so much time that night was already approaching. And so you tell him to stop and sit down at that moment, but the protagonist can't walk properly. He says he was hungry, and you said everything was fine. He even prepares a stew for them to eat. The protagonist had a spoon and a bowl in his hand and thus asked to use the spoon no matter what. He eats it, and the food is really good. He starts to eat it even faster, saying that it was very delicious. He said it was a soup or even a stew. It was so good the protagonist was eating a lot. He looks at the man who was smiling at him and asks if he's not going to eat. The man gets up and talks to listen while he eats. He came to that place to get out of the forest, and at that moment he was trying to get stronger. However, he is not a forest demon beast. He is just a weak human who does not have strong claws or sharp teeth. No matter how hard he tries, there is a limit for the human body. So, that was why he would be thinking about teaching how to use a sword. Tomorrow he holds a wooden sword and points it at the protagonist. But before that, he would show what a sword is. The man holds the sword against the protagonist and then takes him to a rock, asking him to observe carefully. Then he moves this sword in a circular fashion, which makes his eye shine. Then he lets out his last breath and hits the ground once again. The protagonist says that he just saw lightning coming out of that piece of wood, and that was exactly it. The man attacks again and again, cutting that stone in half that was in front of them. Then, in the middle of it, it explodes into several pieces, and the protagonist feels impressed by this situation. After that, he says that this is how human beings survive. The protagonist asks what he just did, and so he says he is Vis. Just like demonic beasts have demonic energy. Imagine that it was an invisible source of power that humans can use. Although this seed of darkness inside the protagonist's body has different properties and is a similar source of power. So it is the power that he felt when he met the other two. That was incredible. He also wants to learn, but he gets slapped in the face with everything, and he falls to the ground, saying that he shouldn't be so impatient, as his body was not yet prepared to receive this power. What matters most to him now is understanding the sword. You look at the protagonist and say that it would be difficult, distressing, and sometimes it would also be painful, but he must move on and not give up. If he spills the hearts of others, the sword could reward him for it. It is at this moment that he hands the sword to the protagonist, and he holds it. Then begins your intense training. You ask him to focus. That scream of pain, the protagonist asks, how many days was it? Now, in the past, his form was good, but you say that he decided to throw a teenage tantrum against him, and you believe that he told you to address him with respect at that moment. The protagonist says that he was addressed correctly. He even calls him sir, but is answered with a little. So what would be the problem? He says he's a brat. Having proper form isn't everything. It was just to think a little. So, he needs to explain everything to understand. The protagonist says that it is necessary to explain everything because he didn't explain anything from the beginning. Since then, anyway, he won't understand anything. You keep talking like that. The more he watches, the more he realizes he's weird. He has no creations to learn, but still, his growth is exponentially incredible. At that moment, the seed of darkness influences humans and makes them act more violently. Most of all, he grew up with demonic beasts. Not so contrary to what it looks like. This child is incredibly smart. He's not docile, but he's tenacious and doesn't give up that easily. Is there anything so different about him? The man approaches and says that he would teach. Then, after a while, he attacks the protagonist's sword with everything and says that he has become weaker. The protagonist screams, asking why he hit him twice. The man asks if he noticed the difference in these two attacks, and the protagonist says no. Going by the answer, it seems like he doesn't even feel like having dinner today. The protagonist says it's not true and waits. He's starting to understand the amount of pain. He's different. The speed at which the places he hit were also different, and he calls him sir. But why that? The movements were the same. This was strange. And now you understand, imitating the external appearance is not enough. The tiny difference in your muscles, the tremors in your fingertips, the speed and the flow and the movement that rises, the understanding comes from there with your sword. All of this must be under the control of the protagonist. Only then will he be able to say that he really learned something, dedicating his heart and soul to each movement. At that moment, he will truly understand, and now that he is doing nothing but waving his arms around senselessly. He is no longer a swordswoman but just a lumberjack. And now, once again, they would continue with training. And so said and done, the protagonist begins to think and calls the man, saying that he said to rest, as this is also part of the training. But now that he's not swinging the sword, it's kind of boring. Then, Leopard approaches, and the protagonist says that it's been a long time since they've seen each other. Leopard asked if it was his imagination or the protagonist had grown a lot in that short period of time. Was it true? Well, it's just like an acorn has turned into a chestnut. Well, he's going to grow a lot more. So it was to be worried. And now that he stopped to think, you said you owed Leopard a debt. And he confirms, he said he wanted to live there. So he gave him special permission to do so. But he doesn't like living with anyone and doesn't want to fight with them. Well, it looks like living with a human has made you stupid. He owns the forest, the roots, the central areas. No matter who upsets, he will fight anyone and maybe not everyone. In fact, he was being cautious to be attacked by a disgusting snake while fighting. He asks about the snake, and the protagonist immediately thinks it was in the southern region of the forest, its name, Naho, although he remembers that, well, that snake has 2 heads, and it was after that human. If the 2 of them exhaust themselves fighting each other, he would never find a better opportunity than this. So what if you fight that human? Would I win? Leopard doesn't respond at first. He just says, who knows, since demonic beasts like him expose their energies and can tell by instinct. However, humans do not disperse this energy naturally, which means they can hide their own strength. And the protagonist, he is wary of this. So, wouldn't that brother win? He's saying he's not sure, even though the snake doesn't like that human. That's why you can't even touch it. Wait, why wouldn't I? Because that human destroyed that horrible region that the snake built. There were many questions from the protagonist. So, Leopard only asks the question if he is curious at that moment. And it was clear he hates not knowing things and what it would be like at that moment. So, it was right. The protagonist climbs on top of the leopard and takes him somewhere, saying he would show him a corner. He passes over the trees and flies away. The protagonist says that would be strange. Leopard, say it was true. It's a horrible region that ended up talking about. So, there were people being enslaved, women being killed. And so it was a human farm. They arrived in that small village where there were many slaves. It was a human farm. One of them ends up falling, and a man appears with a whip, telling that bastard to do his job. So he hits it hard, saying, Stop pretending you were hurt and get up at once. The protagonist says that it looks like he was injured. Why would you be hitting him so much? Why isn't he doing the job right? And what would he be looking at that moment? He asked the girls if he should hurry up and run inside. Then the women arrive. They were very confused, but everyone was taken inside. The protagonist asks what it is. They are similar, but they are different. Leopard asks if he was talking about female humans. They were entering when it was still light. Those females are food. Just yet being humans, they have a different gender, and that is what differentiates a man from a woman. The snake prefers one of the females because their meat is soft and they don't have many muscles. But if they are too small, you can't eat anything. Then they wait until they grow before eating. Females become food for the snakes, and males are made slaves for the rest of their lives to maintain that space. That's why it's a farm, right? Even though they say the snake protects that farm, what keeps them, in truth, are humans among themselves. They have a leader. At least you can tell that place. And it was that bald guy who was there who asked what the commotion was about. He is respected, and so the master says that one of the slaves made a mistake. Forget that. Have you gathered all the sacrifices for today? Yes, they were all there. He asks if it's true, and as he observes, he calls her green hair and says he would make an exception for her. I would let her live longer and scream for mercy. Is that human the leader? The protagonist asks and says yes. He doesn't know how that human knows, but they are very good at finding humans who were left in that forest. And if he wasn't lucky, he would probably become one of them, or even worse than that. He understands and asks why he didn't treat her like that. Leopard says he doesn't like the idea of cattle and snakes increasing in their number. Then the protagonist smiles. That seems like something he would do. So he just cheers, thinking about it. Now, if he's gathering humans, it means there's something going on. Leopard tells him to stop it, and he should go back now. But he smells a strange smell, and a mysterious voice asks, "Look who we have here." At that moment, a two-headed snake appears in front of the leopard, which enters a fighting position. This was one of the faces I missed seeing, and they both call each other by name and come face to face with each other. Leopard asks if he wasn't sleeping for some reason, and the protagonist gets scared. At the beginning, he wasn't even saying anything, but the pressure was enormous. That kid heard that he was raising males. They taste better when eaten young. How about giving him a piece? The leopard says, no, he doesn't eat humans, even males. Eats. And he wouldn't like the taste of it. That's right, the humans he prepares for him are especially delicious. However, that smell, he approaches the protagonist with those two huge heads, creating enormous pressure on the boy, and asks what relationship he has with the human being, Darian. So the protagonist doesn't respond. The one who appears in front, throwing an attack, is the leopard, who says he's cursed. And where does he think he was putting his filthy face? The snake moves away a little, and then it shouldn't be so distressed, as it is a lover of peace. It would just be checking on him, as it smelled that bastard on his clothes. That boy has only been a few years since he destroyed his own farm. It would be strange if you didn't find him. You would be cautious about that human being. He has no relationship with that guy. He simply stole the clothes to wear. That was it. It was a relief. So, if he hadn't been there, he would have punished him. If you touch a hair on him, you'll rip that snake's guts out. He says it's scary. He was just joking because I don't want to fight the leopard at all. They've known each other for a long time, after all, and most importantly, you ended up there, because though soon. Now I hope he never goes back to that place again. Just thinking about having dirty fur all over the territory makes me sick. The leopard looks at the protagonist, who was in enormous tension, probably afraid, and says, "Goodbye." The protagonist, he is distressed, and so he falls to the ground, ends up fainting, watching Pardo take the protagonist very far, who then wakes up, saying that his head was hurting. And then, Leopard says that since the snake saw him, he shouldn't be traveling alone from now on, as he has to stay with that human. Since the snake is being cautious with Leopard, he won't come to that territory, but you never know for sure what could happen. The protagonist says he was right, and why he looks so grumpy at that moment. He needs to be careful with things, that way there's no way around it. He's still quite young. The protagonist asks, and Pardo is confused by his reaction. Then he goes on to ask if he thinks he could become as strong as Leopard or even that old man, and asks if that will be too difficult. Leopard says that he's strong, but he doesn't really know how strong he is. He's at a level that most humans wouldn't be able to reach, even if they tried their whole lives. The protagonist asks about this whole thing, then says that it won't be easy. It all depends on how he does it. If he really wants to get stronger and get out of this forest, then he was to do his best, no matter what happens. Then they look at each other, and the protagonist looks down. The human was approaching. Then he says, "See you later," and the man approaches the protagonist, saying that it looks like he took a trip with that leopard. They greet each other, and the man says that the sun was setting, and they should return home as soon as possible. However, the protagonist doesn't say anything, and so Leopard just keeps an eye on him, saying that he would take care of the protagonist, no matter what happens. He lifts his head, smiles a little, and continues forward, saying that everything would be okay. So we continued our story, with the protagonist sleeping, and it looked like he was feeling sick. He says his stomach hurts so much, and then he thinks he would really die. So, we go back in time. You had given something to the protagonist and said he should eat it before going to bed today, and wonder what it is. The man said it was a poisonous herb, and the man told him to eat it. Then, the protagonist asks if he is being told to take poison, so he goes all out. It was to be eaten without complaints, as this will help suppress the power of the darkness seed. But this could be poison, but I didn't say it would hurt that much. At that time, the protagonist starts to twitch, so he asks what he was feeding him and shouts the man's name. At that moment, he was on a hill, alone, 5 years, no, about 4, maybe. So we jump to the next day, where the protagonist was training, trying to understand the sword again. He messes with everything in the tree, thousands and thousands of times, until he tries to cut it down somehow. And the man approaches the protagonist. He seemed to be intensely angry and asks if he started to enjoy using the sword. He says that his body has felt very light lately, and it seems like his vision would be clearer. Strange as it may seem, it could be due to the poisonous herb. This could be the effect of the demonic soil. Haven't you been going crazy recently? He says it's no longer like the refreshing feeling of the morning after. You see, a few weeks ago, we started consuming demonic soil, and we think it was time. He takes a board and talks to the protagonist. If he remembers about the power he had talked to him about, he can't see the power. But that's why he can endlessly cram into it. But if the body and procedure are not at the basic level, there is no point in training that power. The reason he didn't teach it in the past is because until now he wasn't at that level, but now his body seemed to be ready to accept it. Then they will start. They will teach the training method. The man then looks directly at the protagonist, holds that stick, and takes a deep breath. A huge golden aura appears on him, which puts pressure on the protagonist, throwing him down a little. The Lord continues speaking to dissolve the energy in the atmosphere in the body and thus control it freely through the sword, and points forward, saying to incorporate that. That's how you control that kind of power. And that's what you should do from now on. And so hand it over to him to get the sword. Control breathes in the background as she finds that gentleman. He must absorb the energy of nature, think simple and move with composure. Then he advances to the protagonist, saying that if he loses his rhythm, he should forget about that power. So, he defends the Lord's attack, saying that his body would break first, before all this, and the man tries to make another attack with his hand. But the protagonist dodges, and the sword comes forward with everything, making him dodge again, hitting the tree, almost breaking it completely. And yes, the protagonist asks to wait, in case he is really trying to kill him, and since he can lose his composure so quickly, he didn't teach the protagonist to be like that. But then he asks to wait, and so he starts breathing. The protagonist lowers this sword. Then a small moment arises in him, but he still goes forward with everything to attack. His attacks are defended as if they were nothing, and his attacks are defended as if they were nothing either. So the Lord keeps talking to utilize the senses and absorb the energy so that he can feel the full power. The protagonist is thrown a little back, and it's not possible for someone to be perfect from the beginning. He was supposed to continue training like this from now on, and that's okay. It was going to take some time. But he attacked again, and the swords faced each other and just showed them. The protagonist starts to smile and says so to show his will. Then he moves forward with everything, thousands and thousands of times. He was supposed to keep moving without rest and not lose the rhythm, but he continued faster, dissolving the energy of his own body. It continued over and over again, day after day. Training after training without stopping, he continued until a light shone on the protagonist's body and an aura was born. So, 4 years passed, it was starting to get cold, and the protagonist cut down his tree. So he says everything was fine. He should stop training for today. It's been 4 years, and you show up. The protagonist asks if he was being watched. Well, he says that it would be a little better now, and asks about it, saying that he still thinks it was incomplete. Anyway, he asks if he could watch a duel today. Before that, it was to show his time. He says he doesn't want to. He did this last time, and refused to duel the protagonist. After telling who was still without something, the man tells them to just do it quickly, and the protagonist gives up and still does it. Then, an hour appears over him, and so I said that's what I said before. But when a protagonist holds this sword down, and a purple hour appears around him, you say that being able to manifest the power so quickly showed that he had incredible growth. He has the seed of darkness, but he is also very talented, and so the protagonist starts to get tired. This boy will definitely turn a world upside down, in some way, whether for good or for bad, sir. Then, he opens his eyes, and says it was time to let him go. He wonders about this for a while, and the protagonist doesn't quite understand. It seems like the time had come. He asks what he meant by that. Yes, it was time to leave that forest. But the protagonist thinks he hasn't become that strong yet. And if the seed of darkness grows more than that, he won't even be able to pass through the divine barrier. It has to be now. Pay attention. He will explain everything. The human world is beyond the south, in the forest of roots. You need to go through the divine barrier to get there. I heard that there is a certain safe area, in theory, you can get through to get to the human world, even if it has a seed of the darkness, the human who can deal with the weakened barrier. Theoretically, I should be able to pass. He asks where that is. He doesn't know either. He never tried to find her at that time, but there is someone who did. There is a village of humans in the territory of the two-headed snake. The village chief must know. That leopard knows where the village is, by the two-headed snake that would say that thing called Naho, and by Erugo. It probably means about who takes care of the human farm. So, the protagonist is confused. You say that, finally, he will experience countless things in the human world. He, who has only lived in the forest, may find the world exciting and fun, but tragedy always sneaks up on him. The protagonist does not finish responding. It's not something he can stop. It's just being cautious, and it also cannot be avoided when the day comes. You will wait and feel the helpless pain in your heart. He expresses and experiences frustration and despair and could even reach the depths of darkness. But under no circumstances, do not get lost. He puts his hand on the protagonist's shoulder and says that's all he asks for. He has some questions. He said he didn't have it. No intention of coming with him, right? The man says yes, and the protagonist becomes intense. If he has nothing else to say, then he will take a nap. He has something to give. Then come back in the morning. He would like to spend time alone after everything that happened. The protagonist is alone in that place while the man leaves there. And so, in the middle of the night, he was sitting in a corner. The leopard arrives, saying that he doesn't seem so excited, and if that's not the case. The next day, the protagonist turns his face away, saying that this is how it is. He's finally going to leave that place, but he feels like it's complicated and he doesn't know why. Why would he be feeling this way? Leopard doesn't respond. He turns his face away and says it was proof that he regrets it. And slowly he would be becoming a human. The next day, the protagonist enters the master's house and the leopard tells him to go. The protagonist looks back and shakes his head. Then, he enters the house of the master, who was sitting with a sword and a bag in front of him. The protagonist asks what that was. He calls the man's name, saying that he had a vague feeling, but he thinks it was really time to leave that place. You don't say anything else. The protagonist simply picks up the things that were in front of him. And so, he closes his eyes and opens them again, saying that he would remember him forever. Then, he leaves. The leopard says he thinks his lifespan has come to an end, and he knew it. He told me a while ago. I wasn't supposed to make that face, because the journey part was the end. He lived and died as he pleased. So, you don't need to feel guilty about all this. It feels like I could finally give him that thing. And when he delivers it, he asks what it was. Was using this when it was dropped off. I was supposed to take a look. It looks like maybe he'll need that when he gets out of there. It is made of pure gold. It was a rare material. He must have been the son of a pack of nobles. May there be light on your path was written inside. And the person's name was Margaret Irene. Was it the name of the pack leader? Family? It was probably his mother's name. Understand when you find her arriving at that location. What do you think has happened? She might be able to help the protagonist with everything. And he goes to the human farm, right? That guy and that damn snake were hibernating. So, it wouldn't appear unless there is a big commotion. But even so, you entered his territory. It will feel somehow. The protagonist says not to worry. He can take care of himself. And Leopard says he's right. He had to hurry, as this was his only chance to be a gypsy in that place. The protagonist starts walking, but after a while, he stops. Don't look back, just ask Leopard not to die. He says he's right and he should take care of himself too. Then, in the middle of the night, inside the farm, a person wearing a hood appears. This person gets closer and closer. He was the leader of the farm. He looks to the sides and so, in the candle, he creates light and, at the moment he least expects it, he feels a tremor of a sword in his neck. It was the protagonist who was right behind him, telling him not to move. In the midst of this, dark magic, an evil power that can make even seemingly weak water stronger. Among many mages, there are people who go beyond the limits, and who shouldn't go to achieve strong power and magic. Irugo was a wizard who was always jealous of others. He dreamed of becoming stronger, but chose the path of dark magic because he felt he was not talented enough for his purposes. Negative emotions of humans were necessary through activities such as human trafficking and kidnapping. He easily obtained the necessary materials. The suffering and fear that came out of his materials made him more evil and more powerful. However, due to the persecution of a certain wizard, his other cities were exposed to the world, and he was captured and even sentenced to death or even exile. To avoid being executed immediately, he chose the forest of roots and eventually encountered the two-headed snake there. Kneeling, he got permission to stay within the snake's territory, then exchanged submission and sacrifices. This wizard used magic to gather all the humans who were exiled to the forest. After that, they submitted to the demonic beast so as not to die immediately. And that was how the human's farm was created, and he became the king of the farm. While the other humans were treated as mere cattle, the true master of the territory, Naho. He never interfered with that gentleman's work, as long as he was able to do so and offer the sacrifices. Therefore, while serving, he began to become ambitious again, and the whole winter he could not help but be nervous. Also because when the snake hibernated, the demonic beasts in the surroundings attacked doing every day, and even during such significant crises, he had some form of satisfaction in your new life. And so, he says that winter is always the problem, and what he wants that time, the way to get out of the forest of roots. I heard that I knew a method, and it was to say that it is very indecent for such a young kid, And I even heard that Darian accepted a disciple. Was it him? The protagonist does not respond. He just talks to say how he gets out of the forest and why he should. The protagonist brings the sword a little closer, cutting a little bit of his neck, because he will die if he doesn't want to, and if he dies, the snake would wake up from hibernation and would come forward with everything. It could also die if that happens, and what do you think? Can you face that lord? He's just a mere human. It doesn't matter. That snake can revive the dead, right? He's definitely going to die, so he doesn't have much to worry about. He is not one to try any tricks. The gentleman remains silent and says that he was the only person who knows how to get out of this forest and kill himself now. He will never find out how to escape. It was absurd to hear that wizards are crazy about recording such things. You'll eventually find out if you search his house. Just that it's simplifying this process. Lord, he gets tense. So, he says he's pretty tough, and he was right. It will tell you how to get out of the forest. They start to go down some stairs, and the protagonist at all times had his sword at the gentleman's neck, which asks what the protagonist's name was. He says it was none of his business. You say everything was fine, but you wanted to tell him something. The method he discovered is only theoretical. No one has tried it or has the ability to try it. What he is doing at the moment is basically useless, but the method would be possible for that gentleman. And since he is here, that means he has no intention of leaving that place. He asks what happened to that gentleman. There was no answer, meaning he should have been dead at that moment. He starts to laugh, and the protagonist extends his hand as he takes the book, telling him to deliver it as quickly as possible, but the man asks him to wait and says what he thinks of him becoming the successor and living in that place. It was foolish. You keep saying that he is definitely worthy since he is that guy's disciple. Everyone else there is so weak, and he would give every place he has at that moment. The protagonist raises his sword and says he doesn't need what he has. He will survive escaping from that place just to shut up and deliver that book as quickly as possible, just like that. You say everything is fine, and if he hesitates, then there's nothing you can do. That was a book he discovered in a wizard's hiding place. Before he lived in that place, the idea was related to the magic of stealth. Unfortunately, it seems he wasn't able to escape from that place based on that book that has a huge waterfall in the south, on the border of that forest. Water and demonic energy awaken divine power at the same time. He might be able to break through the barrier at that place, and of course, even though they are weakened, it is still a high-level divine barrier surrounding the root forest. Anyone who has even the slightest bit of demonic energy will be turned to ashes. That's all he knows, and that's okay. He'll spare his life, the gate. In that sense, he doesn't like that man very much. But he doesn't treat other lives as something unimportant. He only survived because of that leopard's mercy. That's what Darian taught the protagonist. Then, just as a mercy punch, the protagonist shoves everything into that guy's stomach, and just like that, he's passed out. The protagonist ties him up, and when he wakes up, he has no reaction whatsoever. The protagonist starts to put his finger in various places on him, and thus says that he would be released after some time and not do bad things from now on. You can't use magic, he says. And he says he's an arrogant bastard because he thinks he can get out of that forest alive. The protagonist looks back and says, "Of course," and continues walking along his path. The man gets extremely angry, asking how that kid dares to do that kind of thing. A symbol appears in front of him, and he says that this trust would crush him into pieces, and thus calls the two-headed lord, asking him to wake up as soon as possible. At that moment, the ground starts to break, everything starts to shake, and the snake wakes up once and for all, coming out with everything, breaking several floors, saying that he would find it no matter what. He's a damn kid because he thinks he can get away with it. You can treat that gentleman like that. Nothing is free in this world. One time or another, you will have to pay. And it was to prepare. The protagonist had already jumped through all the trees and escaped from that place, but the snake still appears, saying that he didn't wake up for nothing. Okay, somehow it was an urgent matter, as I'm sure you would understand. As I listened to what you have to say, Darian died and his disciple was there. The snake continues to rise, saying that he understands, as it was a golden opportunity to get rid of the remains of the one he hates. The protagonist had already disappeared from there. He starts jumping over the trees and then he disappears, saying, "It was bad." Would it have been better for him to have killed that man? Monsters appear around him. He says that the demonic beasts are running away without even looking at the protagonist. They are afraid of something. So he feels enormous pressure at that moment and realizes what was happening. He realizes he just needs to run without stopping. He falls to the ground on his feet and says that he still hasn't managed to leave that guy's territory and asks if it ends there. There is demonic energy everywhere in that forest. At that moment, he felt a huge red aura around him. So, he prepares himself with his sword, Gustavo, coming from the tall protagonist. His feet begin to tremble, as well as the ground and everywhere. Two heads appear around him. It was a giant snake that said hello to a young child, saying that he knew he would return to the territory. He doesn't know how long he waited for that moment. He simply couldn't let the protagonist go. "In that case, you would have to be walking over my corpse," the snake starts laughing, saying that now he is much braver than before. But that was insignificant, because how does he believe he will be able to do something with such a fragile body? Trying to resist is futile. Just accept death once and for all. The snake attacks the protagonist, who throws himself onto the ground, creating a huge explosion. The protagonist is dragged back, and he says he can't see anything with all the dust in the air. He can't let his own guard down. He did well dodging the attack. The snake says this to the protagonist. In the middle of this, she stands up around the protagonist, spinning with a totally red aura, and says that it would be good to see how long he can last. Then, the silent protagonist notices the distinct gaze of that huge snake watching him as if he were trash. So he holds this sword, closes his eyes, and says it was time to think calmly because his opponent is strong. But eventually, he'll get a chance. He won't let things go the way he wants. Then, the snake starts to create a red ball of energy that becomes so big that it is bigger than the protagonist. And when she plays with everything, he realizes that now is the time to go after her with everything. And it is at that moment that he advances mercilessly towards the snake. He jumps onto her mouth, dodges a huge attack, jumps on top of her, and just when she tries to attack, he starts running around her entire body. No matter how strong she is, she has a weak point that he can attack with the power he learned. At that moment, he takes his sword out of its sheath and sees that it was perfect. And yes, he cuts that snake's eye in half. Right in her eye, the blade passes as if it were nothing and thus rips one of the visions out of her head. He got the time he needed, but it would be better if he could finish off that snake over there. But that was the most he could do at his current level. No matter what, he ended up expending a lot of energy on that last attack, and if he continued fighting, he would probably end up dead. The snake calls the protagonist an insolent worm and says, "How dare you hurt me?" Then he starts running as far as he can. With the protagonist running, the snake begins to challenge him and thinks about running after him, but he says he has to run away. At that moment, he hears a terrible noise behind him. He realizes something he didn't want to realize. Behind the protagonist, the snake was wanting another head, saying it was a useless head. Then, the protagonist looks back, as his curiosity was enormous. "I can't even withstand a little attack like that. That head, she was the useless one." So, at that moment, she says that she got rid of herself. The next one would be the protagonist, an insignificant member of society. Then, the protagonist attacks with his sword, defending everything. He is thrown back hard, their heads hit. The protagonist, with incredible momentum, hits the ground with everything, creating a gigantic crater. The force of the impact was so intense that it caused the ground to shake. One of the snake's heads still survived, managing to hide in the shadows even after the devastating attack. The snake, now with one less head, would have more difficulty tracking the protagonist. Where did that damn boy go? Thought the furious creature. Meanwhile, the protagonist was panting heavily, every breath a struggle. He knew he was strong, but the battle against that gigantic monster was beyond his capabilities. In the end, the only significant damage he managed to cause was destroying one of the snake's heads. At least I bought some time, he thought, trying to find some solace in the desperate situation. He needed to get away from there as quickly as possible. Suddenly, he feels something huge and threatening approaching from behind. When he turns around, he sees the snake, which had managed to recover and find him again. A dark demonic energy emanated from the creature's immense body, enveloping it in a menacing aura. The snake begins to speak, his voice reverberating with mischief. I finally found you, insolent boy. Did you think you could hide from me in this forest? The protagonist, feeling fear rising within him, does not respond immediately. He takes a deep breath, trying to remain calm even as the tension around him rises. The snake, with eyes full of hatred, advances with all its might, opening its monstrous mouth. The protagonist feels the pressure and adrenaline flooding his body. It was a decisive moment. He knew he couldn't die there. He couldn't let this be his end. Still, the feeling that his final hour was approaching was overwhelming. Just then, a bright, bluish aura appears out of nowhere, interrupting the snake's attack. An agile and powerful leopard appears, gracefully leaping over the protagonist. Long time no see, he says, with a determined look. The two, now side by side, prepare to face the threat together, gathering all their strength for the battle to come. Leopard suddenly appears to save the protagonist, who screams his name in relief. The protagonist puts his hand in front of his eyes, as the demonic energy emanated by the leopard was extremely intense. Leopard, with a determined smile, says he is happy to see that the protagonist survived. He recognizes the protagonist's effort and says he did a good job, but now the rest should be up to him, the leopard. He adds that although he would like to help more, he has an important mission and must leave. You have something more important to do, Leopardo says. Go and find your destination as quickly as you can. The protagonist is unresponsive upon hearing this, especially when Leopard reveals that the most important thing for him is freedom. Almost crying, the protagonist can barely hold back the tears. Don't waste my effort, warns Leopard. Even when the protagonist tries to say something, the leopard doesn't listen. He just insists, go straight and go fast. Without another word, the protagonist thanks him with a lump in his throat and runs away as fast as he can. He knew that his only chance of success was to follow the leopard's instructions. As the protagonist walks away, Leopard advances against the snake. The furious snake screams, "You're just a dirty cat. How dare you invade my territory?" The leopard, with a resolute look, responds, "I'm just doing what's necessary." With that, he launches himself against the snake, determined to face the threat and protect the protagonist. Then the snake began to laugh, a cold, cruel sound that echoed through the forest. "What a thrilling friendship you have," the snake sneered, his eyes shining with contempt. "Disgusting species, united by a pathetic bond. You should really thank me for coming to you. I can kill you both right now and devour that brat." The leopard, impassive, faced the charge firmly. "Do you really think you can achieve something with just one head?" he asked, his tone challenging. "When you can't keep more than two, it would be a good idea to try now." The snake quickly advanced towards the leopard, who used one of his powerful paws to directly attack the reptile. Meanwhile, the protagonist wielded his sword with dexterity, cutting down the demons that were still nearby. It was already dawn, and he wondered if this battle had finally come to an end. After crossing the leopard's territory, the protagonist ran away, maintaining a frantic pace for days. He was determined to stay out of the way of that snake, whose presence posed a high risk. Fortunately, he could cut through any other creature without much difficulty, as long as they were not at the same threat level. Reflecting on his experiences, he realized that if he hadn't encountered Alaga and Darian, he probably wouldn't have survived that desolate place. His survival in that hostile environment was possible thanks to the crucial help he received from these two companions. He knew he owed his life to them and, therefore, needed to get out of that forest as soon as possible. That territory was distinctly different from the leopard's domain. The demonic energy that he could barely feel there was distinct, similar to the darkness that seemed to be reacting. The divine barrier seemed to be interacting with this darkness, but the nature of this reaction remained a mystery to him. The protagonist was determined to uncover the secrets of that forest and understand the true nature of the forces that resided there. With sword in hand and heart full of courage, he would continue his journey, knowing that each step took him closer to unraveling the mysteries that surrounded him. The protagonist asked this about the seed that was in his heart. Would he be happy to cover it in power? If not, there would be a deep problem. He would be happy to cover it anyway. The protagonist thought about a feather he was holding that fell into his hands. He wondered what it would be like when he went up to see a giant bird that looked at the protagonist, asking about him being a human child. "What business would you have in that goddess's territory?" the bird asked. He knew that the black magician talked about it very easily and thought that it was a demonic beast so close to the divine barrier. Her name was Agel. She asked the protagonist's name. He had heard that name before. He eventually came forward and was the ruler of the north. Leopard said that she was very curious about things and thought there was some familiar smell on him. It was faint because of the smell of blood, but she could never forget that smell. Yes, Naho's scent was stuck on the protagonist. The weakest scent, but one that had been on him for a long time, was also Alaga. Interesting. It was very interesting. "Is he a child of the leopard or is he a child of the snake?" she asked. He said he was from the leopard's family, and that was true in this case. This meant that her family had invaded the territory. "He's not here on leopard's orders. He has his own reasons," she said. She asked what the reasons might be. Was that a reason to spare him? Then it was time to hear what was going on. The protagonist needed to calm down. The reason was that he was trying to make power mean something to her. Was it meaning? It was a perfect opportunity to satisfy her curiosity, because he would become the first to cross the barrier and come out of the root forests. She quickly broke down and said that she was a weak human child. Do you think that would be possible? That seed of darkness that is inside you is telling you that you are the same as a demonic beast, she said. He asked to try to leave because he would be the only human who would come to that place and try to overcome a divine barrier. Would something be done? He wanted her to let a cute human he hadn't seen in a while try to burn through the barrier. That would be a waste. There would always be humans falling into that forest, but the only person who could pass through that barrier would be him. And the protagonist was determined to do so. She looked, turned her face, and said that he was very intelligent and wanted to see how he tried. Even as he said, it's true that he's the only person stupid enough to risk his own life like that in that forest. As long as he doesn't realize it, he can survive and die. If he succeeds, he will be the first human to leave that forest, right? Yes, and she will be the first demonic beast to see this happen. He was making things more interesting. Okay, since she really wanted to see how he could get out of that place, she would protect him until he reached the barrier in case something happened. Say the last words if you have any, as I would pass them on to the leopard if necessary, she said. The protagonist, against all odds, not only survived but also managed to emerge from the dense forest. He looked at the housekeeper, whose expectant gaze met his. With ragged breaths, he expressed his conviction that, regardless of the outcome, he wanted her to tell Leopard exactly that his special child made it out of the forest. Taking a deep breath, he recognized that he only had one chance, no more, no less. The protagonist, driven by intense determination, boldly jumped over the lake, diving beneath its waters and advancing towards the only available exit, an imposing barrier. Even surrounded, he persisted unshakably. A small explosion rang out, but that didn't stop him. On the contrary, it intensified his desire to escape. His breathing now labored with adrenaline and urgency. With renewed determination, he pressed further, determined to surpass not only the forests of the roots but also the limits of his own expectations.